How's it going? Adam Drake here, and today I'm going to walk you through the process of building a set of shocks. So I'm going to use the MSB1 shocks, but a lot of the ideas and tips that I'm going to use or talk about in this video can be used for any vehicle, whether it's 10 scale or 8 scale. The 10 scale shocks I feel are a little bit more critical because they use an X-ring instead of an O-ring. And the reason for the X-ring is 10 scale vehicles are lighter and you want to use an O-ring that's going to have less friction. So the X-ring actually has slightly less of like a surface area where it's sealing to the shock shaft. So it's going to create less resistance, have less stiction. The problem is that can be a little bit more critical in terms of making sure that the shock seals well. So I'm going to go over a few tips that will help make your shock seal well, but also work properly and hopefully have no leaking and just overall good performance. So we'll take a closer look and we'll go over building a set of shocks for the MSB1 10 scale electric buggy. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to show you a product I use. It's just Super Lube. It's a silicone lubricant for shock O-rings. A lot of guys use green slime or different lubricants. And what these lubricants are intended to do is we're using a silicone O-ring and also a silicone fluid to control the dampening. Well, that silicone fluid can basically attack the O-rings and make them swell. So with the green slime or with this Super Lube, it's just to put a protective coating on the O-ring so that the silicone oil doesn't affect or attack the O-ring as much. So I just have a little plastic container here. I'll take the Super Lube and just make sure that I put enough in this container so that it just fully coats the O-rings. And the ideal thing to do would be to let these O-rings soak for 30 minutes to an hour. Some will say soak them even longer. Some say 2 days. Some say 2 hours. For me, I just usually let them sit and soak for 30 minutes to an hour. As far as shock pistons, I'm using the new Flashpoint 2.5 millimeter thickness 13 mil shock pistons. I'm going to go with 2-hole 1/8s in the rear and 2-hole 1/7s in the front. So while I'm letting the O-rings soak, I'm going to go ahead and grab the shock shafts here and build up the front and rear shocks. So with the Flashpoint pistons, to make them universal so that they work with the other brands like Associated and TLR, when you put the piston on the Mugen shock shaft, with the Mugen piston, it fits nice and snug when the screw is secured. With the Flashpoint piston, there's just a little bit of end play. So what I do is I take a 1/2 mil ball stud washer. So you'll still use the stock Mugen washer behind the piston, but I will also use, so I'll take the stock washer, put that on, and then I will take a 1/2 mil ball stud washer. Make sure you clean off that surface. Put a little bit of thread lock in the threads and on the threads for the screw. Like I said, I'm going to go with 2-hole 1/7s in the front and 2-hole 1/8 in the rear. So you just want to make sure that that's secure. wipe off any excess oil there. These are going to be my internal and external limiters that we will talk about and use a little bit later in the video. And by adding that 1/2 mil shim under the piston, it will make it to where the piston is secured and fits snug on the shock shaft. So now I'm going to just repeat this for the other 3 shock shafts real quick. Again, installing the 1/2 mil washer on top of the stock Mugen washer. And then installing a little bit of thread lock here. You don't need much, you just want to make sure that this screw can't come loose, and so that you don't lose that screw during a race. Okay, so this is going to be kind of the most critical part to make sure you do. This is going to ensure that the X-rings don't get cut or torn during assembly. What a lot of people will do is they, after soaking these X-rings, will take them out, put them on paper towel just so any of the excess super lube can get taken or wiped off. Again, you want to keep the X-ring coated with the super lube, but any excess can be wiped off. But something that I think ends up happening and damages the X-rings is people will take and assemble the basically the cartridge pack or the seal pack, tighten everything down, and then run the shock shaft through. And with an O-ring, that's okay, because an O-ring, there's less of a chance of damaging it. You have more surface area. They're a little bit more durable. But again, they get sticky. So what I like to do is take the shock shaft, put it through the body, and then what I'm going to do is put a little bit of this super lube on the threads of the shaft, just so that you have a little bit of lubricant. And then I'm going to go ahead and slide the X-ring over the shaft, the guide bushing, another X-ring, and the end guide bushing. So by doing it this way, there's much less of a chance of damaging the X-ring. So if you've already, if you put the X-rings, guide bushing, X-ring, guide bushing in, put this cap on, what happens when you then go to run the shaft through that seal pack, for one, you can't really see what's going on, but if there's any preload on those X-rings, when you go to run the shaft through, there's a sharp corner where the threads end and where the shaft, the smooth part of the shaft starts. So when you run that through, the shaft can actually cut or damage the X-ring. And I have a really good picture from a set of X-rings that was sent in by a customer that was saying that their shocks were leaking. And in that picture, you'll see why. It's because the X-ring was damaged and causing the shocks to leak. So if you assemble it like that, there's much less chance of damaging any of the X-rings. And then with this nut, you want to make sure that that's really tight. So we're going to just go ahead and do that one more time with the other front shock. We put the shaft through, hold the shaft in place, and then just gently, well, first we'll put a little lube on the end of threads, slide the X-ring over so it just nicely slides over the shaft, guide bushing, the next X-ring, and the end guide bushing. And then again, when you slide all that in, everything just goes in super nice. Secure the nut on the bottom. Make sure that's really tight. And again, super, super free and little to no chance of damaging the X-rings. So we'll go ahead and do this for the rear as well. So for my one rear shock, I forgot to put the 1 millimeter inner spacer. So again, this is super critical. You don't want to keep this nut tight and then just run the shaft through the X-rings. So I'll want to actually remove this altogether, pull that guide bushing loose so that the shaft can go clear or pass through the O-rings. And then reassemble it that way, because if there's any preload on those X-rings, and with how sharp the threads are, because the threads need to be sharp to be able to dig into the shock end so that you don't pull out a shock end. So yeah, you just want to be really careful to make sure you release any of the pressure from the X-rings anytime the shaft and the threads pass all the way through. So from there, I'm gonna install my external limiters. These shocks are gonna go on my car where I'm gonna be running carpet. So the shock limiters are a little bit different than what you would run for dirt. So I just thread the end on to where it just starts to bind up the ball, back it off a 1/2 mil. It's not a bad idea to also measure this distance just to make sure it's consistent from right to left. So we'll repeat that with the other ear. And then now with the fronts. So again, with these 10 scale shocks, because of the type of seal that's being used, the X-ring, the assembly of all this is a little bit more critical. You know, it may seem like overkill if you've only ever raced 8 scale and you're used to just putting some green slime or super lube on the O-rings, run the shaft through. The design of the shock shaft is a little bit different on the MSB1 than on the 8 scale stuff. So with the 8 scale shafts, to help add a little bit of durability, when basically where the threads start to end and go into the shaft, it's not as sharp or as harsh of like a end of thread start of the shaft. So the threads kind of taper off. So even though the threads are sharp, it's not as sharp of a transition from where the shaft ends and the threads start. So there we have our shocks built. Now all that's really left to do is to build and bleed the shocks. I have other videos on bleeding for emulsion, but so I'm going to just quickly go through and do one of these rear shocks. If you have or want more information on building the shocks or bleeding the shocks, I have other videos on that. So basically I'll fill the shock body up, slowly move the shaft up and down. You'll see some air that was trapped under the piston come out. So I'll fill it the rest of the way up so that the oil is just slightly domed over. You'll see the air bubbles come to the top. And normally you would just leave the shock sitting on a car stand or shock stand to kind of let the majority of that oil or air in the oil go out. But for the video purposes, I'm going to just speed it up a little bit. So when you put the cap on, if the oil's domed over properly, a little bit of oil will come out of the bleeder hole. And as far as bleeding the shock, I just have the bleeder screw ready. Take a microfiber towel, and then I'll just, as I'm compressing the shock, oil's coming out of the bleeder hole, I'll just wipe off any of that excess oil until the shock is fully compressed. Then I'll run the bleeder screw in, make sure to wipe off any excess, and then I'll pump the shock a few times. You'll see that there's just a little bit of rebound, which in most conditions you don't want. So I'll leave the shaft where it's at naturally, so the amount of rebound that came out. Take the bleeder screw out, and then I will compress the shock the rest of the way and reinstall the bleeder screw. Check the shock by pumping it a few times. You can see it still comes out. So I'm going to go ahead and bleed it one more time. A lot of times when you have brand new O-rings, because there's so little stiction, the shock will actually be at its freest, so you'll get just that little bit of rebound, but you want to pump and bleed the shocks a few times to get them to where they're basically dead. So this one just barely comes out, which I'm fine with that. And then as far as bleeding your shocks on race day, it's really important, especially in 10 scale, to bleed your shocks, especially if there's any change in temperature, mainly when the temperature goes up. So if you bleed your shocks in the morning and when the weather is cool and it gets a little bit hotter, you definitely want to make sure you re-bleed your shocks. If it's the opposite, if you bleed your shocks in the middle of the day when it's the hottest and it cools off, it's not as critical to re-bleed your shocks, but it's not a bad idea to re-bleed your shocks just to be on the safe side. But if your shocks were bled when it was at its hottest and then it cools off, you'll have a little bit of extra air in the shock, which is better than having too much oil in the shock and having it hydrolock or have a lot of rebound. So hopefully this helps you build your MSB1 shocks or shocks for any vehicle for that matter. Again, all these tips can be used for 10 scale and 8 scale shocks, and it's not really brand or manufacturer specific. So any vehicle that you have, you can use these tips to build your shocks to make sure they are smooth, work properly, and don't leak.